The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days in the small market town of Berkhamsted, turning the usually bustling high street into a series of puddles and empty shop fronts. Sarah Mitchell stood behind the counter of her family's small bakery, watching the water drip from the broken gutter outside her window. At 62, she had run Mitchell's bakery for over 30 years, but she had never faced a challenge quite like this. The flooding had started on Monday morning when the nearby River Bulbourne burst its banks after the heaviest rainfall the area had seen in decades. By Tuesday evening, half the shops on the high street were under 2 feet of murky water. Sarah's bakery had been spared the worst of it, sitting slightly higher than the neighboring businesses, but she could see the devastation through her windows. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop next door had lost everything. Her beautiful displays of roses, tulips, and seasonal arrangements now lay ruined under layers of mud and debris. The elderly woman had built her business from nothing after her husband's death 15 years ago, and Sarah had watched her work tirelessly to create something special in their small community. The local news crew had arrived that morning, their bright yellow rain jackets standing out against the gray sky as they filmed reports about the flooding. Sarah had seen them interviewing the mayor and several business owners, but she hadn't expected much to come of it. Small towns like theirs rarely stayed in the headlines for long. What Sarah didn't know was that someone had been watching those news reports with particular interest. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had been having her morning cup of tea when the story about Berkhamsted appeared on the BBC breakfast program. She paused with her cup halfway to her lips, studying the images of the flooded high street, and listening to the reporter describe how local businesses were struggling to cope with the damage. The camera had lingered on Mrs. Henderson's flower shop, showing the elderly woman standing in her doorway, looking lost as she surveyed the destruction. Catherine felt something stir in her chest, a familiar pull she had learned to recognize over the years. This wasn't about protocol or official duties. This was about real people facing real problems, and she wanted to help. Catherine quietly excused herself from the morning's planned activities and asked her private secretary to make some discreet inquiries about the situation in Berkhamsted. Within an hour, she had a clear picture of what had happened and which businesses had been affected. She also learned that the local council was stretched thin, trying to coordinate cleanup efforts while dealing with insurance claims and emergency housing for displaced residents. By late afternoon, Catherine had made a decision that would surprise everyone, including her own staff. She wanted to visit Berkhamsted, but not for a formal royal engagement with cameras and crowds. She wanted to roll up her sleeves and actually help with the cleanup efforts. Her protection team was less than thrilled with the idea. Unannounced visits created security nightmares, and the princess visiting a disaster zone without proper advance planning went against every protocol in their handbook. But Catherine had made up her mind, and those who knew her best recognized the determined set of her jaw that meant there would be no changing it. The compromise they reached was typically Catherine. She would visit the following morning, with minimal security and no advance notice to the media. Her lady-in-waiting would call ahead to the local council leader, but only an hour before her arrival to prevent word from spreading. She would bring practical supplies and be prepared to work, not just observe and offer sympathy. That evening, Catherine spent time researching flood cleanup procedures and what supplies would be most useful. She loaded her Range Rover with rubber boots, cleaning supplies, bottled water, and several dozen sandwiches she had asked the palace kitchen staff to prepare. She also included warm blankets and basic first aid supplies, remembering from her early morning engagements with various charities that disaster victims often needed these simple comforts more than grand gestures. Sarah Mitchell arrived at her bakery early the next morning, as she had every day for 30 years. The rain had finally stopped, but the aftermath was everywhere. Mud clung to shop windows, debris littered the pavement, and the smell of stagnant water hung in the air. She began the process of checking what stock she had left and planning how to help her neighbors begin the long process of recovery. She was arranging some day-old pastries to give away to cleanup volunteers when she noticed a dark Range Rover pull up across the street. Sarah glanced at it absently, expecting to see insurance adjusters or council officials. Instead, she watched in amazement as a familiar figure stepped out of the passenger seat. It couldn't be. But the elegant posture, the distinctive hair, and the way the woman moved with quiet confidence made Sarah's heart skip a beat. She blinked hard and looked again. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was standing on the high street of Berkhamsted, pulling on a pair of Wellington boots and surveying the flood damage with the focused attention Sarah had seen in countless photographs. But this was different. There were no photographers, no crowds of officials, no red carpets or formal greetings. Catherine was dressed in dark jeans, a practical sweater, and a jacket that had clearly seen better days. She looked like any other volunteer who had come to help with the cleanup, except for the discreet security officer who emerged from the driver's seat and the unmistakable presence that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Sarah found herself frozen behind her shop window, clutching a tray of pastries and trying to process what she was seeing. This wasn't how royal visits were supposed to happen. Where were the advance teams, the local dignitaries, the carefully choreographed meetings and presentations? Instead, Catherine walked directly to Mrs. Henderson's ruined flower shop and began speaking quietly with the elderly woman, who looked as stunned as Sarah felt. Within moments, Catherine had taken off her jacket and was helping Mrs. Henderson carry damaged flower displays out to the street, her movements efficient and purposeful. Word began to spread quietly among the shopkeepers and volunteers, but in the way of small communities, people seemed to understand instinctively that this was something special and different. No one reached for their phones to take pictures. No one called out or tried to approach for autographs. Instead, they simply watched in amazement as the future Queen of England got her hands dirty, helping their neighbors recover from a disaster that few outside their small town had even heard about. Sarah Mitchell finally found her courage and stepped outside her bakery, still carrying the tray of pastries. She approached Catherine and Mrs. Henderson carefully, not wanting to interrupt, but feeling compelled to offer help. As she drew closer, she could hear Catherine's voice, warm and genuine, asking practical questions about insurance and what Mrs. Henderson needed most urgently. "Excuse me," Sarah said softly, and both women turned toward her. "I brought some pastries for the volunteers. Would you like some? They're from yesterday, but they're still good." Catherine's face lit up with a smile that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. "That's incredibly thoughtful of you." "I'm Catherine," she said simply, extending her hand as if she were any other volunteer. "Sarah Mitchell. I run the bakery across the street," Sarah replied, shaking the offered hand and marveling at how normal it felt, despite the extraordinary circumstances. "These look wonderful," Catherine said, taking a pastry and immediately offering the tray to Mrs. Henderson. "Have you eaten anything today, Mrs. Henderson?" The elderly woman shook her head, her eyes still red from crying over her ruined business. "I haven't had much appetite. To be honest, you need to keep your strength up," Catherine said gently, placing a supportive hand on Mrs. Henderson's arm. "The cleanup will take time, and you'll need energy for all the decisions ahead." What happened next would become the story that spread through Berkhamsted and eventually captured the hearts of people across the country. Catherine didn't just offer sympathy and move on to the next business. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves and spent the next 3 hours working alongside Mrs. Henderson and other volunteers to clear mud and debris from the flower shop. She hauled buckets of dirty water, scrubbed mud from display cases, and carefully sorted through damaged inventory to see what might be salvaged. Her expensive jeans became stained with mud. Her hands grew dirty and rough from handling debris, and her hair came loose from its neat style. But she never complained or showed any sign of wanting to be anywhere else. Tom Bradley, a local council worker who had been coordinating cleanup efforts, initially tried to suggest that Catherine might prefer to observe rather than participate directly. "Your Highness, we have everything under control here. Perhaps you'd like to visit some of the other affected businesses?" Catherine paused in her work, a mud-stained bucket in her hands, and gave him a look that was both kind and determined. "Tom, isn't it? I'm not here to observe. I'm here to help. And please, just call me Catherine today." The moment that truly surprised everyone came when they discovered that one of Mrs. Henderson's prize orchids, a delicate pink and white beauty that had taken 3 years to bloom, might be salvageable despite being buried under mud and debris. Catherine spent nearly an hour on her hands and knees, carefully cleaning the plant and examining its roots with the patience of someone who genuinely understood the value of what she was trying to save. "My grandmother taught me about orchids," Catherine explained to Mrs. Henderson as she worked. She always said they were stronger than they looked. But you had to treat them with respect. Mrs. Henderson watched in amazement as Catherine gently rinsed mud from the delicate petals, her movements careful and knowledgeable. You really know what you're doing, don't you? A little, Catherine replied modestly. I've always loved gardening. There's something about working with growing things that helps me think clearly. Young Jamie Morrison, a 16-year-old who had been helping with cleanup during his school holidays, later told reporters that watching Catherine work was unlike anything he had expected. She wasn't putting on a show or anything. She just worked like everyone else, except maybe a bit harder. And she remembered everyone's names after hearing them just once. The princess had indeed taken the time to learn the names of every volunteer, from the council workers to the teenagers who had come to help. She asked about their families, their businesses, and how the flooding had affected them personally. When she learned that Jamie was hoping to study environmental science at university, she spent several minutes discussing career options, and even mentioned a scholarship program she was familiar with that might help with his fees. The thing that surprised me most, Jamie would say later, was that she actually listened, like, really listened. When I told her about wanting to study rivers and flooding because of what happened here, she got this look like she was really thinking about it, not just waiting for me to finish talking so she could say something nice. Perhaps the most touching moment came when 80-year-old Frank Cooper, who ran the small hardware store next to the flower shop, mentioned that he was thinking about closing down rather than dealing with the insurance and repairs at his age. Catherine stopped what she was doing and sat down beside him on an overturned crate. Tell me about your store, Frank. How long have you been running it? Frank's weathered face brightened as he talked about the business his father had started in 1952, how he had grown up sorting nails and helping customers, and how much pride he took in being able to fix almost anything someone brought to him. As he spoke, Catherine listened with complete attention, occasionally asking questions that showed she understood both the practical and emotional aspects of what he was describing. It sounds like this town would lose something special if you closed, she said finally. Have you talked to anyone about what kind of support might be available for the repairs? When Frank admitted he felt overwhelmed by the paperwork and didn't know where to start, Catherine quietly made a note in her phone. Later that day, without any fanfare, she arranged for a specialist from a royal charity that helped small businesses to contact Frank directly with information about grants and low-interest loans specifically designed for disaster recovery. By mid-afternoon, word of Catherine's presence had spread through the town. But something remarkable had happened. Instead of creating chaos or turning the cleanup into a media spectacle, her presence seemed to energize everyone. More volunteers appeared, bringing supplies and offering help. The work progressed faster than anyone had expected, and there was a sense of community spirit that went far beyond the usual response to a local crisis. Sarah Mitchell found herself working alongside the princess to set up a makeshift food station for volunteers, using supplies from her own bakery and donations from other businesses. As they arranged sandwiches and filled thermoses with tea, Catherine asked detailed questions about running a small business, the challenges of competing with chain stores, and how the community supported local enterprises. You've built something really special here, Catherine told Sarah as they worked. It's clear that people rely on you for more than just bread and pastries. Sarah felt a flush of pride at the recognition. We try to be a gathering place, I suppose. Somewhere people can come for a chat, as much as for their morning coffee. That's exactly what communities need, Catherine replied. Places where people know they belong. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that Catherine had no intention of leaving until the work was done. When her protection officer quietly approached to mention her scheduled evening engagement, she politely but firmly explained that her current commitment took priority. The evening event, a formal dinner with visiting diplomats, would have to be rescheduled. The decision surprised even those closest to her. Catherine had always been dutiful about her official obligations, rarely changing plans unless absolutely necessary. But something about this day, these people, and this work felt more important than protocol and formal responsibilities. As evening approached, Catherine showed no signs of wanting to leave until every bit of cleanup for the day was complete. She helped load the last of the debris into council trucks, ensured that Mrs. Henderson's salvaged orchid was properly secured for transport to a temporary greenhouse, and made sure Frank Cooper had all the contact information he needed for disaster recovery assistance. It was only when Sarah Mitchell invited everyone for tea and sandwiches at her bakery that the reality of the day seemed to hit the volunteers. Here they were, sharing a simple meal with the Princess of Wales, who sat on a plastic chair eating a ham and cheese sandwich as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "This has been one of the most productive cleanup days we've had," Tom Bradley admitted, shaking his head in amazement. "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen a community come together quite like this." Catherine smiled, but deflected the credit. "It's because people here care about each other. That was obvious long before I arrived." What none of them knew was that Jamie Morrison had quietly documented part of the day on his phone, not for social media or personal gain, but because he wanted to remember how it felt to see someone with such a privileged position choose to spend their time helping ordinary people without any expectation of recognition or reward. The footage Jamie captured showed Catherine laughing with volunteers, carefully tending to the rescued orchid, listening intently to Frank's stories about his hardware store, and working alongside everyone else, as if she had been part of the community for years. Most importantly, it showed her in moments when she clearly didn't know she was being filmed, revealing a genuine warmth and engagement that couldn't be manufactured for cameras. It wasn't until 3 days later that the story began to emerge publicly. And even then, it happened gradually and organically, rather than through official palace communications. Mrs. Henderson, overwhelmed by gratitude and still processing what had happened, mentioned Catherine's visit to a journalist who was following up on the flood recovery efforts. "She spent hours helping me save what I could," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "She got down on her hands and knees in the mud to save my orchid. I've had royalty visit our area before for official events, but this was different. This was personal." When the journalist asked for more details, other volunteers began sharing their experiences. Frank Cooper described how Catherine had listened to his concerns about closing his business and then quietly arranged for expert help with his insurance claims. Sarah Mitchell talked about the princess, asking thoughtful questions about small business challenges and the role of community gathering places. The story that emerged painted a picture that surprised even those who followed the royal family closely. This wasn't the carefully managed, protocol-driven royal engagement that people had come to expect. This was something much more spontaneous and authentic, a glimpse of who Catherine really was when the formal requirements were stripped away. Jamie Morrison's footage, when he finally decided to share it with permission from everyone involved, provided visual proof of what the volunteers had described. The images showed Catherine covered in mud, her hair escaping from its ponytail, her expensive clothes stained and rumpled, but her expression focused and content as she worked alongside her temporary colleagues. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media filled with comments about Catherine's true princess moment and praise for her willingness to get her hands dirty for people she had never met. Royal watchers noted that this type of unannounced, hands-on engagement was virtually unprecedented in modern royal protocol. "What Catherine did in Berkhamsted represents everything people hope for in their future queen," wrote royal correspondent Rebecca Matthews. "She didn't just visit to be seen and offer sympathy. She rolled up her sleeves and worked. She listened. She remembered people's names and stories. She followed up to make sure they got real help, not just royal attention." The impact in Berkhamsted itself was profound and lasting. Mrs. Henderson's flower shop reopened 6 weeks later, and the story of Catherine's help with the orchid had brought so much attention that customers came from neighboring towns to support the business. The rescued orchid, which had not only survived but thrived in its temporary home, was given a place of honor in the shop window, with a small plaque that simply read, "Resilience." Frank Cooper decided not to close his hardware store after all. The assistance Catherine had quietly arranged, combined with the boost in community support following the story's publication, gave him both the practical help and the renewed purpose he needed to rebuild. He kept a copy of the newspaper article about Catherine's visit framed behind his counter, not as a boast, but as a reminder of what community support could accomplish. The ripple effects extended far beyond the individuals Catherine had helped directly. The story inspired similar grassroots volunteer efforts in other flood-affected communities across the country. The hashtag #TruePrincessMoment began trending as people shared stories of unexpected acts of service and genuine leadership in their own communities. Perhaps most significantly, the Berkhamsted visit marked a shift in how Catherine approached her role as a senior royal. While she continued to fulfill her formal duties with the same grace and professionalism she had always shown, she began incorporating more of the spontaneous, hands-on engagement style she had discovered that day. 6 months later, when severe storms hit communities in Wales, Catherine quietly arranged to visit affected areas with minimal advance notice, bringing practical supplies and working directly with local volunteers. The model she had established in Berkhamsted became her preferred approach to crisis response, though she was careful never to let these visits become routine or lose their genuine spontaneity. Sarah Mitchell received a personal thank you note from Catherine several weeks after the visit, but what touched her most was a follow-up inquiry 6 months later, asking how the community's recovery was progressing and whether the small businesses were managing to rebuild successfully. It was clear that Catherine's concern hadn't ended when the cameras arrived and the story became public. The thing about that day, Sarah would tell people who asked about it, was that you could see she genuinely cared about us as people, not as a royal duty or a photo opportunity. She wanted to know our names, our stories, what we needed to rebuild. And she followed through. That's what made it special. The visit to Berkhamsted became a defining moment in Catherine's evolution as a royal. But more importantly, it revealed the heart of someone who understood that true leadership meant being willing to serve others without thought of recognition or reward. In getting her hands dirty alongside flood victims in a small market town, Catherine had shown the country what a modern Princess of Wales could be. Not just a figurehead or a symbol, but a genuine servant of the people who would one day be her subjects. The orchid that Catherine had helped save continued to bloom in Mrs. Henderson's shop window, a living symbol of the resilience and hope that had emerged from an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when a future queen chose to be exactly where her people needed her most.